In the dry, sun-baked valley of Badr, between the ancient trade routes of Arabia, a small group of men faced what seemed like certain annihilation. 313 Muslims, farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, and shepherds stood before an army 3 times their size. The year was 624 CE, and this confrontation would not only determine the survival of a fledgling community, but would also alter the course of world history. This was the Battle of Badr. To understand why this moment became a turning point, we must first journey back to the early 7th century, to the Arabian Peninsula, a land divided by tribal loyalties, pagan rituals, and the harsh laws of survival. In the bustling city of Mecca, the Quraysh tribe held dominion over the Kaaba, the sacred sanctuary that drew pilgrims from across the region. Trade caravans passed through its gates, bringing wealth, spices, and prestige to Mecca's elite families. But beneath this prosperity, a new message began to stir unrest. A man named Muhammad ibn Abdullah, known to his people for his honesty, had begun to preach the worship of one God. His words challenged the authority of the Meccan elite, who profited from the idol trade and controlled the social order. His message of equality, compassion, and monotheism was seen not as spiritual enlightenment, but as rebellion. As more followers gathered around him, men and women from every social class, the pressure on them grew unbearable. Persecution followed, torture, boycotts, and exile. Finally, in the year 622 CE, Muhammad and his followers fled Mecca for Yathrib, later known as Medina. This migration, the Hijra, marked the beginning of the Islamic calendar and the birth of a new community bound not by blood, but by faith. In Medina, the Prophet Muhammad established a society built on mutual support and cooperation between the emigrants from Mecca, the Muhajiran, the helpers of Medina, the Ansar. Yet Mecca was not ready to let them go. The Quraysh saw this new alliance as a threat to their power and trade routes. Tensions simmered, raids on caravans began, and the line between faith and war blurred. By early 624, the Quraysh had decided it was time to end this new movement once and for all. It began with a caravan. Abu Sufyan, one of the leading Meccan traders, was returning from Syria with goods valued at thousands of dinars, an enormous sum. The caravan was guarded but vulnerable, moving through the deserts north of Medina. Muhammad learned of its route and saw an opportunity. By intercepting it, the Muslims could weaken the Quraysh economically and send a clear message. Medina was not to be underestimated. However, Abu Sufyan was no ordinary merchant. Experienced and cautious, he hired scouts to watch the routes. When word reached him that a Muslim force might be approaching, he changed direction, riding swiftly along the coast, and sent a desperate message to Mecca: "Protect your caravan. Muhammad and his men are coming." Panic erupted in Mecca. The Quraysh quickly gathered an army of around 1,000 men, including their most powerful clans, the Umayyads, Maxims, and others. They were armed with 100 horses, 600 suits of armor, and a fierce determination to destroy the Muslim movement once and for all. Among them were some of the most prominent figures in Meccan society: Abu Jahl, Utbah ibn Rabi'ah, and Umayyah ibn Khalafman, who had led the persecution in Mecca. Meanwhile, Muhammad assembled his companions, but instead of a mighty army, he had only 313 men. Most had no armor, few had horses, and their weapons were simple swords, spears, and faith. They rode 70 camels between them, taking turns to walk across the scorching desert sands. Still, when the call went out, every one of them answered. They marched south from Medina toward Badr, a valley surrounded by rocky hills and dotted with wells, an ideal location for battle and survival in the desert heat. As they approached, word arrived. The Quraysh army was already on its way, and it was massive. That night, the air in the Muslim camp was thick with tension. Some questioned whether they should continue, but Muhammad gathered his men and spoke with calm resolve. He reminded them that they had not come seeking blood, but that they must defend what they had built. When he asked for their counsel, the leaders of Medina stood up, one after another, pledging loyalty and courage. "We will not say to you what the Israelites said to Moses," one declared. "Go you and your Lord and fight. We will stay here. No, we say, go you and your Lord and fight, and we will fight beside you." It was a moment of unity that transformed fear into purpose. At dawn on the 17th of Ramadan, the two forces faced each other across the Valley of Badr. The Quraysh formed their ranks with confidence, banners raised high. Their numbers alone made victory seem inevitable. The Muslims, outnumbered 3-1, took position near the wells. Following Muhammad's strategic orders, they filled and sealed the nearby wells to deny water to the enemy, keeping only one source under their control. The first clash came in the form of traditional Arab duels, warriors from each side stepping forward to fight in single combat before the battle began. From the Quraysh came Utbah ibn Rabi'a, his son Walid, and his brother Shayba, of renown and strength. From the Muslims came Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and Ubaidah ibn al-Harith, each a close companion of the Prophet. The duels were fierce but swift. Hamza and Ali's blades struck true, and the Quraysh champions fell. The sight sent a ripple through the Meccan ranks. The invincible warriors of Mecca had been defeated. Then the battle began in full. Dust and cries filled the air. Arrows darkened the sky. The clang of swords echoed across the valley. Despite their smaller numbers, the Muslims fought with precision and discipline. Muhammad stood at the rear beneath a simple shelter, praying with intensity, calling upon divine aid and urging his men forward. Witnesses would later recall his words as the tide of battle began to turn. The Quraysh ranks began to falter. Confusion spread among their leaders. Abu Jahl, the fierce opponent of Islam, was struck down by two young warriors. One by one, the chiefs who had led the persecution in Mecca fell. Within hours, what had begun as a confident march of conquest turned into chaos. The Quraysh fled across the desert, leaving behind their dead, their weapons, and their pride. 70 of their men lay slain, and another 70 were captured. Among the dead were some of the most influential men in Meccan society, figures whose loss sent shockwaves through Arabia. The Muslims, meanwhile, had lost only 14 of their own. It was an outcome no one could have predicted. When the dust settled, the Valley of Badr was silent. The battle was over, but its impact had just begun. For the Muslims of Medina, this was more than a military victory, it was validation. After years of exile and persecution, they had faced the greatest power in Arabia and prevailed. The victory cemented Muhammad's leadership and established the Muslims as a rising force on the Arabian stage. Tribes across the peninsula, once hesitant to ally with Medina, began to take notice. The tide had turned, but victory brought new challenges. What to do with the prisoners of war? What to do with the spoils of battle? For a community guided by new moral principles, these questions were more than practical, they were ethical. Some argued for ransom, others for punishment. Muhammad ultimately decided that those who could pay ransom would be freed, while those who could not would earn freedom by teaching literacy to Muslim children. It was a striking contrast to the customs of vengeance and enslavement that had defined Arabian warfare for centuries. The Battle of Badr also reshaped the balance of power in Mecca. The Quraysh, humiliated and enraged, began to prepare for revenge. Abu Sufyan, who had escaped with his caravan, swore never to rest until the Muslims were crushed. Over the next years, more battles would follow Uhud, the Trench, and others, but none would carry the same shock as that first encounter at Badr. Beyond the battlefield, the psychological and symbolic significance of Badr rippled across Arabia. For the first time, the idea that a small, united community could overcome tribal might challenged the old order. The Muslims were no longer a persecuted minority. They were a movement with destiny. For historians, Badr marks a rare convergence of faith, strategy, and circumstance. The geography of the valley, its wells, its terrain, its bottlenecks played into Muhammad's tactical genius. The morale of the Muslims, forged through hardship and unity, stood in stark contrast to the Quraysh army, which was rich but divided. Even Meccan chroniclers later admitted that arrogance had blinded their leaders. But perhaps what truly made Badr a turning point was what it represented: a shift in the moral and political landscape of Arabia. The tribes that had long lived by blood feud and pride now saw a new kind of power emerging, one grounded in belief, discipline, and a sense of higher purpose. The victory gave Islam legitimacy, transforming it from a local movement into a regional force. In the months that followed, the Muslims' confidence grew. Treaties were formed, alliances secured, and Medina began to flourish as both a spiritual and political capital. The community's laws, rituals, and institutions took shape, marking the foundations of what would become the Islamic civilization. Yet the Quraysh, still burning from defeat, would not forget. Within a year they would march again, leading to the Battle of Uhud, a reminder that history rarely pauses for triumph. But the legacy of Badr endured. For generations to come, Muslims would recall it not merely as a victory, but as a moment of transformation when faith, resolve, and strategy intertwined to shape history's path. Today, the name Badr evokes more than just a battle. It symbolizes a turning point in human resolve. It speaks of the 313 who stood against impossible odds and prevailed. It reminds historians and believers alike that sometimes the smallest armies fight the greatest wars, not with numbers or wealth, but with conviction. And as the desert winds continue to sweep over the silent valley where it all took place, the echoes of that day remain faint but eternal. The clash of steel, the cries of courage, the whispers of destiny. For in that lonely plain of Arabia, 313 men changed the course of history forever. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking and subscribing for more upcoming videos.